You are listening to Where the Heather Grows, written by Beryl Coops. When silence takes hold of a house, it learns the shape of the people who live inside it. In London, two lives move carefully around that hush-measured footsteps, quiet cups of tea, thoughts kept in their lanes. Then a small, forgotten thing turns up like a seashell in a coat pocket, and the hush is no longer empty. It points north, toward open sky and weathered hills, where the wind has a voice and stone holds the warmth of a hand. This is a story about what we keep, what we build, and what the land gives back when we ask it to listen. Where the Heather Grows, a map unfolds not on paper, but in the heart, and every step changes the sound of home. Where the Heather Grows. Chapter 1. The Silence After. The silence in the house on Calthorpe Street had a texture. It was thick and heavy, a porous substance that absorbed all other sound, leaving behind only the dull, high-pitched hum of absence. It had settled in the rooms over a year ago, a fine, gray dust that no amount of cleaning could eradicate. Imogen stood at the kettle in the minimalist kitchen, a space of sharp angles and cool granite. The click of the switch was obscenely loud. The rumble of the boiling water was a minor earthquake. She held her breath, waiting for the noise to be swallowed again. Across the open-plan room, David sat at the reclaimed oak dining table, his broad shoulders hunched over a laptop. The frantic tap-tap-tapping of his keys was a Morse code of desperation, a frantic attempt to telegraph that he was busy, he was occupied, he was elsewhere. He hadn't designed anything new in 11 months. He was just managing, pushing digital paperwork from one side of a screen to the other. They were a study in monochrome. Imogen, in a gray cashmere jumper and black trousers, her blonde hair pulled into a loose, careless knot. David, in a charcoal Henley and dark jeans, the silver at his temples more pronounced than it had been a year ago. They were a beautiful, broken, still life. Imogen made 2 teas. Darjeeling for her, English breakfast for him, 1 sugar each. A year ago, it would have been 1 for her, 2 for him, and a third, milky and weak in a colorful mug adorned with a cartoon owl for... Her hand faltered, and the teaspoon chimed a sharp, discordant note against the china. She placed his mug on the table, a good foot from his laptop. He didn't look up, but his typing stopped. A grunt. That was the currency of their communication now. Grunts. Nods. The sigh of the refrigerator door closing. "I'm going up," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. Another grunt. An acknowledgement. A dismissal. She climbed the stairs, each step a minor agony. The second floor was their shared space, but it felt like a museum wing dedicated to a forgotten civilization. Their bedroom door was ajar, the bed made with military precision. And then, there was the door at the end of the hall, closed. Christine's door. Imogen's hand rested on the cool, white paint of the door. A faint, sticky ghost of a glittery star sticker still clung near the handle. Her heart began its familiar, frantic drumming against her ribs. This was her ritual, her penance. Every day, she would stand here. Some days, her courage failed, and she would turn away, the guilt a cold stone in her stomach. Other days, like today, a strange, magnetic pull drew her forward. She turned the handle and stepped inside. The room was a perfect, frozen moment. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dancing dust motes in the air. A row of well-loved stuffed animals sat in a neat line on the pillow. A book on hedgehogs lay open on the small desk. A faint, sweet scent of child and vanilla shampoo still lingered, or perhaps Imogen just imagined it, her mind desperate to fabricate what time was stealing away. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand over the purple duvet cover. She picked up a worn otter named Puddle, holding it to her nose. The scent was almost gone. A sob welled up in her throat, sharp and sudden, but she choked it back, Crying here felt like a violation of the room's sacred stillness. Her gaze fell to the floor. A corner of the blue rug was tucked up slightly. She'd never noticed that before. She leaned over, intending to smooth it flat, and her fingers brushed against a loose floorboard beneath the bed's frame. It shifted with a faint creak. Imogen froze. This was new. This was different. Her breath hitched. She knelt, her knees protesting against the hard floor, and pushed the bed skirt aside. There it was. A small section of floorboard, slightly less dusty than its neighbors, that didn't sit quite flush. She worked her fingernails into the narrow gap and pried it up. A cavity, dark and small. And inside, nestled in the dust and shadows, was a book. Not a school exercise book, but a hardback artist's sketchbook, its cover a deep, vibrant blue. With trembling hands, Imogen lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked. She sat back on her heels, the loose floorboard forgotten, the rest of the room blurring into insignificance. This was Christine's secret, a thing hidden, a part of her daughter she hadn't known. She traced the cover with her thumb, then, with the reverence of someone opening a holy text, she opened it. The first page was a title, written in Christine's best, looping handwriting, the O's drawn as little hearts. My project book, for the magic house on the hill. Beneath the title was a map. It was crudely drawn but meticulously detailed, with landmarks labeled in her childish script. A winding path for adventures, a big spooky tree, good for climbing, and a bumpy hill where the wind sings. And at the top, the name of the hill, carefully copied but slightly misspelt, Tolvah Scar Point. Imogen's breath caught. She turned the page, and her world, which had been gray and silent for so long, exploded back into color. There were drawings of the house from every angle. It wasn't a grand house, but a whimsical, organic structure that seemed to grow from the earth itself. It was round, with a turf roof, so the birds and sheep won't know it's a house. One drawing showed a large, round window, labeled, "For watching the morning sun have its breakfast." Another showed a low, curved wall, to hide from the grumpy wind. Page after page, the vision unfolded. A star-gazing room with a glassless skylight. A fireplace for stories and toast. Shelves built into the walls for treasures. Rocks, feathers, lost buttons. Notes were scribbled everywhere. The walls must be stone, like a dragon's skin. The door must be red, so we can always find it. This was no casual doodle. It was a blueprint. A passionate, detailed dream. Tears came then, not the silent, hopeless tears she was used to, but hot, urgent ones that fell onto the pages, smudging the pencil lines. She had thought she knew every corner of her daughter's mind, every dream, every fear, but she hadn't known this. This was a fully formed, secret world Christine had carried inside her. She heard David's heavy tread on the stairs, heading for their bedroom, the familiar, closing door. A sudden, fierce protectiveness seized her. This was hers. This secret, this last piece of Christine, was for her alone. She quickly but gently closed the sketchbook, hugged it to her chest, and slid the floorboard back into place. She stood, her legs shaky, and slipped out of the room, closing the door softly behind her. In the hallway, the silence felt different. It was no longer empty. It was charged, pregnant with a secret. Back in her own bedroom, she undressed in the dark, the sketchbook hidden under her pillow. She lay beside David's sleeping form, listening to his steady, distant breathing. And for the first time in 367 days, Imogen did not feel the crushing weight of the past. She felt the terrifying, exhilarating pull of the future. A future that involved a bumpy hill, somewhere in Scotland, where the wind sang. She didn't know how, but she had to find it. Chapter 2. The Project Book. The digital clock on David's side of the bed glowed 3:17 in the morning. The house was at its most silent, the kind of deep quiet that exists only in the pre-dawn hours of a city, a lull between the late-night revelers and the early morning lorries. For Imogen, it was no longer silence. It was a canvas, and upon it, her daughter's voice was speaking to her. She lay on her side, her back to David's sleeping form, the blue sketchbook open on the pillow. A small, discreet booklight was clipped to its spine, casting a soft, intimate glow over the pages. She had been studying them for hours, the images etching themselves onto the back of her eyelids. This was not merely reading. It was an excavation. The first pass had been a torrent of emotion, a chaotic flood of grief and wonder. Now, on her third meticulous examination, she was an archaeologist, piecing together the lexicon of her daughter's final, secret passion. The house, Christine's magic house, was not a castle or a fairy tale palace. It was something far more profound. It was a part of the landscape. The walls were indeed to be stone, but her notes specified they should be the gray and green kind, with lichen, so it looks old and wise. The roof wasn't just turf. It was a meadow roof for bees and butterflies. She had drawn specific wildflowers, harebells, clover, and patches of heather. Heather. Imogen's finger traced the spiky little purple strokes. That was the title, wasn't it? Where the Heather Grows. It wasn't just a phrase. It was a location, a specification from the project's chief architect. She turned a page to a detailed cross-section. Christine had understood fundamentals of shelter that defied her 10 years. The thick stone walls were for keeping the cozy in. The large south-facing window was to trap the sunbeams for a nightlight. There was a profound, innate wisdom in these designs, a child's uncluttered understanding of harmony with nature that David's sleek, award-winning urban structures, for all their technical brilliance, could never hope to achieve. Her throat tightened. David. What would he see in these pages? Would he see the genius, the soul, or would he see the scribbles of a child, a messy, emotional folly? He dealt in concrete realities, in stress load calculations and planning permissions. This world of grumpy winds and sunbeam nightlights was a language he had unlearned. A fresh wave of grief, different from the one she was accustomed to, washed over her. It was the grief of realizing that Christine had possessed this entire, complex inner world, this quiet, purposeful dreaming, and she, her own mother, had been oblivious. She'd been so busy with the day-to-day school runs, packed lunches, ensuring homework was done, that she had missed the grand project unfolding in her daughter's heart. She turned to the map at the front. Tolvah Scar Point. The name was Gaelic, she was sure of it. It looked like something from the Highlands. With a sudden, decisive movement, she slid out of bed, the cold floorboards a shock to her bare feet. She padded silently to her study nook in the corner of the bedroom, waking her laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated her pale, determined face. She typed the name into a search engine. The result was immediate. A location on a walking forum. Tolvah Scar Point, a minor summit in the Cairngorm Mountains, near the village of Killyhuntley, Inverness Shire. A remote, wind-swept hill known for its dramatic views and exposed terrain. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was real. It wasn't a fantasy land from a storybook. It was a real place, on a real map. Christine had somehow found it. Perhaps in a book, a documentary, a stray comment. She had latched onto it, and it had become the site of her dreams. She opened the satellite imagery and zoomed in. The land was a tapestry of muted greens and browns, scarred with peat hags and dotted with rocks. It was brutal, empty, and utterly beautiful. And there, on its western flank, was a specific curved contour that exactly matched the bumpy hill in Christine's drawing. Imogen, David's voice, thick with sleep, made her jump. She snapped the laptop shut, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. "What are you doing?" he mumbled, propping himself up on an elbow. He squinted at her in the darkness. "It's 4 a.m. "Couldn't sleep," she whispered, her voice tight. "Just checking emails." It was the first outright lie she had told him in their marriage. The deception felt like a physical weight in her stomach. He grunted, a sound of pure exhaustion, and fell back onto his pillow. "Come back to bed. Staring at a screen won't help." She didn't move. She sat in the dark, listening to his breathing even out again. The secret, now fully formed, sat between them in the bed. A third, living entity. The sketchbook was a physical truth that made their careful, silent life feel like the lie. The next day, while David was at his office, a co-working space he went to just to be out of the house, Imogen went to war. She spread the project book, her laptop, and a notepad on the dining table David's territory. She called the local council in Inverness-shire. She navigated automated switchboards and was eventually connected to a bemused but helpful woman in the land registry department. "Killa Huntley? Oh, aye. Out past Glenmore. What was the name again? Tolvah Scar Point? You're interested in a plot there?" An hour and several hold-on deers later, Imogen had a name: Hamish McAllister. The majority of the land, including the specific hill, was part of his family's farm. She was given a number. Her hand trembled as she dialed. It rang for a long time. "Aye," a rough, elderly voice answered, the single syllable laden with a soft Scottish brogue. "Mr. McAllister? My name is Imogen Hartley. I'm calling from London. I understand you own the land at Tolvah Scar Point?" There was a long pause. "I do. What's your business with it?" How could she possibly explain? My dead daughter drew a picture. She took a steadying breath. "I'm an artist. I'm looking for a remote, inspirational place. I was hoping to inquire about purchasing a small plot, the western flank." Another, longer pause. She could hear the faint crackle of a fire and the bark of a dog in the background. "The west flank? Lass, that's naught but heather, rock, and wind. You can't build there. There's no access, no services. It's good for grazing a few sheep and little else. Why would you want a patch of that?" "For the grumpy wind, for the sunbeams, for the bees. It's for a personal project," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "A retreat. I understand the challenges. I would still like to discuss it. Would you be willing to sell?" Hamish McAllister let out a sound that was half laugh, half cough. "You English and your notions! I'll not be selling you a useless piece of hill so you can plant a flag and forget about it. If you're serious, you come up and see it. See it in the rain and the cold. Then we'll talk." He hung up before she could reply. Imogen stood, gripping the back of a dining chair, her knuckles white. He thought she was a frivolous city dweller, a fool. But he hadn't said no. He'd given her a challenge. That evening, David came home to find her not listless by the window, but at the table, maps and printouts spread before her. A spark of something concern, annoyance, flickered in his eyes. "What's all this?" he asked, shrugging off his coat. Imogen looked up, the project book safely hidden away. This was the moment. She had to plant the seed. "I've been doing some research," she began, her heart thudding. "I think I need to get away, for a little while, out of London." David's expression closed. "Away? To where?" She gestured to the map of Scotland on her screen. "The Highlands. It's so quiet there. I think it might help." He stared at her, his architect's mind likely seeing the impracticalities, the distance, the isolation. He saw a problem to be solved, or more accurately, a symptom to be managed. "Imogen, running away to the middle of nowhere isn't going to change what happened here," he said, his voice low and weary. This, this grief, it's in us, not in the postcode. The condescension in his tone, the sheer logical certainty of it, was a match to Tinder. The secret she was holding, Christine's precious dream, flared into a defensive rage. "You think I'm running away?" she said, her voice trembling with a intensity that hadn't been there in a year. "You sit there, day after day, tapping at that screen, building nothing, feeling nothing. You've built a wall around yourself so high I can't even see you anymore. At least I'm trying to feel something other than this nothingness." David recoiled as if struck. His jaw tightened. "Feeling something? Is that what you call this? This morbid fixation on maps? This is healthy to you? I'm dealing with it, Imogen. I'm getting through the days. That's all there is now. There is no magic cure in the Scottish Highlands." "You're not dealing with it," she cried, tears of fury and pain springing to her eyes. "You're burying it. You're burying her. And I can't live in this grave with you anymore." The words hung in the air, final and devastating. They were the truest, most terrible thing she had said to him since Christine died. David's face went blank, a mask of stone. He looked at the maps on the table, then back at her, his eyes cold. "Fine," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Go to your Highlands, but don't expect me to follow you into the wilderness to watch you fall apart." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing amidst the scattered maps, the chasm between them now a canyon, and the ghost of their daughter's dream, the only thing she had left to hold on to. Chapter 3. The Hill of Tolvah Scar Point. The train north was a needle stitching England together, then unpicking it at the seams. London's gritty brickwork gave way to the flat, green expanse of the Midlands, which later rumpled into the dramatic fells of the Lake District. Imogen watched it all through the glass. A silent film playing beside her reflection, a pale, determined woman superimposed over a changing landscape. She felt untethered, a balloon cut loose. The argument with David echoed in the rhythmic clatter of the tracks. "Don't expect me to follow you, to watch you fall apart." His words were a cold stone in her pocket, a weight she carried with her. But alongside the hurt was a flicker of something else, something that felt dangerously like freedom. For the first time in a year, she was acting, not just reacting. Inverness was a shock of crisp, peat-scented air. She hired a small, utilitarian car, its interior smelling of antiseptic and pine, and began the final leg of the journey. The sat-nav soon lost its signal, and she relied on a paper map and the increasingly vague directions Hamish McAllister had grudgingly given her over the phone. The tarmac narrowed to a single track, hemmed in by dry stone dikes and banks of rust-colored bracken. Sheep, woolly and unconcerned, dotted the hillsides like moving rocks. Then the dikes fell away, and the land opened up into a vast, breathtaking emptiness. The Cairngorm Mountains rose in the distance, not jagged and dramatic, but ancient and worn, their curves like the backs of sleeping giants. Killyhuntley wasn't so much a village as a clutch of whitewashed houses and a small stone church huddled in a glen as if for protection. The air was cold and clean, scoured by a wind that whispered of distance and solitude. She found the McAllister farm at the end of a rutted track, a low, stone steading with a slate roof, smoke puffing contentedly from its chimney. Hamish was waiting for her, leaning against the side of a mud-spattered Land Rover. He was a man in his late 70s, built of the same sturdy, weathered stuff as his farm. His face was a road map of wrinkles, and his eyes, a pale, watery blue, assessed her with unnerving directness as she climbed out of the car, her city shoes sinking into the soft ground. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, not as a question. His gaze took in her designer jeans, her thin wool coat, the palpable urbanity of her. He didn't offer a hand. "Mr. McAllister, thank you for seeing me." "Aye, well, said I would," He jerked his head towards the Land Rover. Best take this. That wee thing. He nodded dismissively at her hire car. Won't make it past the first burn. The journey up the hill was a brutal, jolting affair. There was no road, only a track worn by generations of sheep and tractor tires. The Land Rover groaned and pitched, climbing steadily. Imogen gripped the handle above the door, her knuckles white, her body thrown against the seatbelt. She said nothing, just stared out at the unfolding wilderness. It was harsher than the satellite images, more alive. The heather was a brownish purple, not yet in full bloom, a coarse carpet that stretched for miles. The wind buffeted the vehicle, a constant, low moan. It was utterly, profoundly exposed. After 20 minutes that felt like an hour, Hamish pulled to a stop, cut the engine, and nodded ahead. There's your hill. Tolvah Scar Point. Imogen pushed the door open and stepped out. The wind seized her, whipping her hair across her face, tearing at her coat. It was a physical force, this grumpy wind Christine had written about. She had to lean into it to walk forward. And then she saw it. The exact contour from the map in the project book. The specific, bumpy rise of the western flank. Her heart stopped, then hammered back to life. It was real. It was all devastatingly real. She unzipped her handbag and pulled out the blue sketchbook, her fingers numb with cold and emotion. She didn't need to open it. The image was burned into her mind. She looked from the page to the land and back again. This is it, she whispered, the words stolen by the wind. Hamish had come to stand beside her, his hands deep in the pockets of his waxed jacket. He glanced at the sketchbook, at the childish drawing of the house, then back at her face, which was streaked with tears she hadn't felt herself shed. It's a hard place, he said, his voice quieter now, almost gentle. It's no a gentle spot for a retreat. The wind here, it doesn't stop. It gets inside you. I know, Imogen said, her voice cracking. She wasn't talking about the wind. She was talking about the grief, the purpose, the terrifying magnetic pull of this spot. This is the place. He studied her for a long moment, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He saw the raw grief, the city softness, but he also saw the fierce, unyielding determination underneath. Who was she? He asked quietly. The question was so unexpected, so perceptive, that it shattered the last of her composure. A sob escaped her, harsh and dry. My daughter, she managed, clutching the sketchbook to her chest like a shield. Christine. She drew this. Before she died. The words hung between them in the vast, empty air. The wind seemed to still for a moment, holding its breath. Hamish McAllister looked away from her, out across the immense, empty landscape. He gave a slow, deep nod, as if a great mystery had been solved. Aye, he said, the single word laden with a lifetime of understanding loss, of the hard, practical business of life and death on the land. I thought it might be something like that. He turned and started walking back to the Land Rover. Come on, then. We'll go back to the house. My wife, Morag, will have tea on. We can talk about your plot. 2 days later, after a conversation over strong, sweet tea and Morag's shortbread, after signing papers at a solicitor's office in a nearby town, Imogen Hartley became the owner of 3 acres of barren, wind-scoured hillside on Tolvah Scar Point. It cost less than the bespoke kitchen they'd installed in their London home. She rented a small, damp-smelling cottage on the edge of Killyhuntley, its rooms furnished with cast-offs and the lingering chill of previous winters. She bought thick socks, a heavy kettle, and a pair of sturdy boots. She spent her days on the hill, the project book open on a rock, trying to hear Christine's voice in the wind, feeling both closer to her and more alone than she had ever thought possible. She was building a monument, yes, but in the face of that immense, indifferent landscape, Surrounded by the ghost of her daughter's dreams, she had never felt so small, or so terrified that David might have been right. That this was not a path to healing, but a deeper, more solitary way to fall apart. Chapter 4. The Unwanted Visitor. A week on the hill had carved new lines into Imogen's hands and a new rhythm into her days. The initial, terrifying vastness of the place had shrunk to a series of practical problems, and for that, she was grateful. Grief was a luxury she couldn't afford when her fingers were numb from trying to hammer a stake into the iron-hard ground, or when the driving Scottish rain found its way through the seams of her expensive, but ultimately inadequate, waterproof. The rented cottage was a mile from Hamish's farm, a stone box that held the cold like a cellar. It smelled of damp wool, coal smoke, and a faint underlying note of mildew. She'd bought a cheap mobile phone with a weak signal, its sole purpose to be her tether to the outside world for deliveries and, though she hated to admit it, emergencies. She had not called David. The silence from London was a wall she had neither the energy nor the inclination to scale. This morning, she was wrestling with a roll of heavy-duty tarpaulin, the wind trying to tear the vast sheet of blue plastic from her grasp and send it sailing over the glen like a demented kite. She had staked out a rough, circular area matching the foundation in Christine's drawings, and her first naive idea had been to cover it, to mark the territory as hers. The hill, it seemed, had other ideas. "Stubbornness will nae beat the wind, lass," a voice called out. Hamish stood a few yards away, his border collie, Finn, sitting obediently at his heel. He'd taken to checking on her most days, his arrivals silent and unannounced. He never offered effusive sympathy, just a grunt of approval when he saw she'd managed a task correctly, or a quiet, practical correction when she hadn't. "It has to learn who's in charge," Imogen grunted, finally securing a corner with a heavy rock. Hamish gave a dry chuckle that was lost on the wind. "This hill was here long before you or me. It'll be here long after. You dinna tell it what to do. You learn to work with it, or you fail." He walked over, his eyes scanning her crude markings. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the stakes. "You'll want to dig a trench for your foundation. No, just lay stone on top. The frost will heave it to pieces in a winter, and you'll need a permit for anything more permanent than that tarp." Imogen sank back on her heels, frustration a bitter taste in her mouth. A trench. Permits. It was a universe away from Christine's simple, beautiful drawings. "I don't know how to dig a trench." "I've a mini-digger in the barn that's seen better days," Hamish said, as if offering a spoon instead of a mechanical solution. "I can show you the basics. It's no brain surgery, just heavy work." Before she could answer, the distant, unfamiliar sound of a car engine, laboring and out of place, reached them. They both turned. A sleek, dark gray SUV, so obviously a hire car, was crawling carefully up the track Hamish's Land Rover had made, its low-slung chassis scraping ominously on the heather and rock. Imogen's heart plummeted into her cold, wet boots. She knew that car. She knew the determined set of the driver's shoulders, even from this distance. David. He parked a respectful distance away, the engine cutting out, leaving only the wind's relentless chorus. The door opened, and he stepped out, a stark contrast to the landscape in his dark wool overcoat and city shoes. He looked pale, his face a mask of controlled disbelief as his gaze swept over the scene. The desolate hill, the flapping blue tarpaulin, the mud-spattered, rain-soaked woman kneeling on the ground, and the old, weathered farmer standing beside her like a guardian from a myth. He walked towards them, his steps careful on the uneven ground. His eyes met Imogen's, and the look in them wasn't concern. It was a cold, simmering anger. "Imogen," he said, his voice tight. "David." She stood up, brushing Pete from her knees, feeling like a child caught in a forbidden act. "What are you doing here?" What am I doing here? He repeated, a humorless smile touching his lips. He gestured vaguely at the surrounding wilderness. I think the more pertinent question is, what are you doing here? I told you. I needed to get away. This isn't getting away, Imogen. This is self-flagellation. His voice was low, but it carried on the thin air, every word a carefully aimed dart. Living in a hovel, wrestling with plastic sheets on a godforsaken hilltop. I thought you were grieving, not having a breakdown. Hamish cleared his throat, a low, rumbling sound. I'll leave you to your talk, he said to Imogen, his tone neutral. He gave David a curt nod, a look of plain assessment in his eyes, before turning and walking back to his Land Rover, Finn trotting at his heel. The moment he was out of earshot, the dam broke. How could you do this? David's control snapped, his voice rising. Buy a piece of land without even discussing it? Throw away thousands of pounds on a bog? What is this, Imogen? What is this really about? It's about Christine. The words were torn from her, raw and immediate. The wind snatched at them, but they hung between them, sharp as glass. Everything is about Christine, he shot back, his own grief finally roaring to the surface. Don't you think I know that? Don't you think I feel it every second? But this isn't honoring her memory. This is a shrine to your own misery. You're trying to bury yourself out here with her. And you're trying to bury her in spreadsheets and silence in London? She screamed, the tears now freezing on her cheeks. You want to pack her away in a box and pretend it didn't happen? Well, I can't, I won't. She had a dream, David, a real, actual dream. And it was here. A child's drawing, he yelled, throwing his hands up in exasperation. A fantasy! You're building your life around a 10-year-old's fantasy. It's not a fantasy to me, she cried, her body trembling with rage and cold. It's all I have left of her that's real. It's a purpose. Something to do other than just disappear. They stood there, chests heaving, the wind whipping their words away into the vast, uncaring sky. The chasm between them was no longer theoretical. It was this physical distance on a Scottish hillside, the gulf between his pragmatic despair and her desperate, driven hope. David looked away, out over the bleak, beautiful landscape, and she saw the fight go out of him, replaced by a weary, profound sadness. I'm not going back to London, David, Imogen said, her voice quiet but absolute. Not yet. He nodded slowly, as if he'd known this all along. He shoved his hands deep into the pockets of his coat, his shoulders slumping. Fine, he said, the word flat and final. Then I'm staying too. Her eyes widened. What? Why? To babysit me? To prove I'm insane? No, he said, meeting her gaze, his eyes bleak. To make sure you don't bankrupt us. To make sure this project has at least a semblance of structural integrity before it falls down around your ears. He paused, his jaw tight. And because, God help me, I can't just go back to that empty house and wait for you to fall apart out here alone. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't support. It was a declaration of a different kind of war, a siege. He was digging in, not to help her build, but to ensure her dream didn't become their mutual ruin. He turned and walked back to his car, leaving her standing alone on the hill, the grumpy wind her only companion, more isolated than she had been before he arrived. Chapter 5. The First Stone. The Cold War began in the cramped, damp cottage. David took the smaller bedroom, the one that smelled most strongly of damp, as if using the discomfort as a form of penance. They established a brittle routine, separate mornings, a silent shared lunch of bread and cheese, and evenings where Imogen pored over the project book and David scowled at his laptop, running financial models that undoubtedly showed the project as a catastrophic failure. The first major skirmish was over the vehicles. Imogen, armed with research and a newfound practicality, announced her intention to buy a second-hand Land Rover and a tractor with a trailer. "It's not a suggestion, David. It's a necessity," she said, her voice calm but firm over the breakfast table. "Nothing else will get up that track consistently. We can't rely on Hamish forever, and without a way to move materials, this stops before it starts." David closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose. "A Land Rover, a tractor. Do you have any idea what that will cost? The insurance? The maintenance?" "I have a better idea of what it will cost to haul bags of cement and roofing timber up that hill on our backs," she retorted. "It's an investment in the project's feasibility." He'd argued, of course. He'd presented spreadsheets. But in the end, the immutable logic of the land defeated him. A week later, a 20-year-old mud-green Land Rover Defender and a battered orange Massey Ferguson tractor with a flatbed trailer appeared outside the cottage, purchased from a retiring farmer 2 glens over. They were dented, rusted in places, and smelled powerfully of diesel and livestock, but their engines, as Hamish had vowed after a cursory inspection, were sound as a bell. The day the digger arrived was the day the war shifted from cold to a tentative, armed truce. Hamish drove his ancient, yellow JCB 3CX up the track on its own slow, grinding power, its massive tires crushing the heather. It looked like a prehistoric insect, all hydraulics and brute strength. "Right," Hamish said, climbing down from the cab. "Who's first?" David, the architect, the master of computer-aided design, stepped forward. "I'll do it." Imogen watched, arms crossed against the chill, as Hamish gave David a crash course in operating the levers. For the first hour, it was a comedy of errors. The digger bucket jerked and swung, scraping the earth rather than biting into it. David's face was a mask of intense, frustrated concentration. But then, something clicked. The machine became an extension of his will. The jerky movements smoothed out. The bucket began to scoop out a clean, deep trench, following the curve Imogen had marked with string and pegs. This was his language, not of grief or emotion, but of physics, mechanics, and precise execution. She saw a flicker of the man he used to be the problem solver, the builder as he carved the foundation of their daughter's dream into the Scottish earth. When he finally switched off the engine, the silence felt different. He was sweating despite the cold, his hands grimy with grease and peat. "The trench needs to be deeper on the windward side," he said, his voice hoarse from the engine's roar. He wasn't looking at her, but at his work. "The frost line is deeper here than in London, and we'll need to lay a gravel bed for drainage before we even think about stone." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't approval. It was a technical observation. But for the first time, it was about how to build, not whether to build. "Okay," Imogen said, the word a white plume in the air. "Thank you." The following week was a blur of back-breaking labor. Using the tractor and trailer, they made countless trips down to the end of the track, where a delivery lorry had dumped a mountain of coarse, hardcore gravel. Imogen learned to drive the tractor, her hands vibrating on the steering wheel, her body jolting over the ruts. They spread the gravel in the trench, David raking it level with a fierce, focused intensity. The first stone was the next milestone. Hamish had directed them to a nearby riverbed, a place where the water had tumbled rocks smooth for centuries. They spent a day there with the trailer, loading heavy, gray stones veined with quartz and lichen, the kind Christine had drawn. Lifting the first one into the trench, Imogen felt a significance that was almost sacred. It was heavy, cold, and real. She placed it carefully, adjusting it until it sat solid and level. David watched, then brought over a second stone, fitting it snugly against the first. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They worked in silence for hours, their breath misting in the cold air, the only sounds being the clink of stone on stone, the grunt of effort, and the endless sigh of the wind. It was brutal, mind-numbing work, Imogen's muscles ached in ways she didn't know were possible. Her gloves wore through. Her back was a single, solid knot of pain. But as the low, curved wall began to rise, a single course high, something shifted. The project was no longer just an idea in a sketchbook or a trench in the ground. It had substance. It had form. At the end of the day, as the late afternoon sun cast long, dramatic shadows across the hill, they stood side by side, looking at their work. A small, curved arc of stone, barely shin-high, nestled in the earth. It was a pathetic thing, in a way. A tiny scratch on the face of the immense landscape. But to Imogen, it was everything. David picked up a small, flat white stone from the pile. He turned it over in his hand, his thumb rubbing its smooth surface. Without a word, he walked over to the section of wall directly opposite where the red door would one day be. He knelt and carefully slotted the white stone into a gap, mortaring it in place with a trowel of concrete. It stood out, a pale, deliberate marker. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the white stone. "For the first one," he said, his voice barely audible. Imogen's breath caught. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. The stone was a keystone for their grief, a marker for the child whose dream was, against all odds, beginning to take root in the cold, hard ground. The grumpy wind blew, but for the first time, it didn't feel like it was blowing through her. It was blowing around the both of them and the small, stubborn wall they were building together. Chapter 6. The Language of Grief. Progress, once measured in agonizing millimeters, began to accelerate with the rhythm of the stonework. The curved wall grew, course by backbreaking course. David, his architect's mind now fully engaged in the primitive problem, had devised a simple plumb line and a string guide to ensure their amateur efforts remained true. He spoke little, but his instructions were clear and practical. "That one's a heartstone. It needs a shim. Or, the mortar's too wet. It'll freeze and crack." Imogen learned. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and nicked, the nails permanently edged with dirt. She learned the language of stone, how to find its bed, the way it naturally wanted to lie, how to choose the right spall, the smaller stone to chip and wedge into a gap. The physical exhaustion was a drug, numbing the sharper edges of her grief. At night, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, too tired to think, too spent to feel anything but the ache in her bones. It was after a long day, with the wall nearly waist-high, that the sky began to change. The wind, their constant companion, fell unnervingly silent. The air grew thick and heavy, the color leaching from the landscape into a uniform, oppressive gray. "Storm's coming," David said, wiping his hands on his trousers as he looked west. "A big one. We need to batten down." They secured the tools and tarpaulins, weighting them down with heavy stones. The first drops began to fall as they climbed into the Land Rover, fat, heavy splatters that quickly became a relentless, driving curtain of rain. By the time they reached the cottage, the world outside the windows was a roaring, gray chaos. The wind had returned with a vengeance, no longer grumbling but screaming, hurling itself against the stone walls. The power flickered, died, and did not come back on. They were cast into a deep, primordial darkness, the kind that existed before electricity, before cities, before everything. The only light came from the frantic dance of lightning through the small windows, each flash illuminating their faces in stark, momentary relief. The only sound was the fury of the storm. Imogen lit the oil lamps she'd bought in the village, their warm, wobbly light pushing back the shadows in the small living area. She built a fire in the hearth, the crackling of peat and wood a small, defiant answer to the storm's roar. David stood at the window, watching the tempest, his silhouette tense. "There goes the tarp," he said, as a particularly violent gust shook the cottage to its foundations. It was a statement of fact, devoid of accusation. There was nothing to be done. They ate a cold supper of bread and cheese in silence, the howling wind making conversation impossible even if they'd had the will for it. Afterward, they simply sat, cocooned in their small pool of light, prisoners of the weather. The storm forced a truce. There were no tools to wield, no stones to lay, no escape to their separate rooms. There was only the weight, and each other. Hours passed. The storm's intensity peaked and then began, imperceptibly at first, to wane. The screaming wind settled back into a powerful, constant howl. The thunder rumbled in the distance, moving away. In the relative quiet, David spoke, his voice rough from disuse. "I was at work," he said, staring into the fire. The day she first complained of the headache, Imogen froze, a piece of bread halfway to her mouth. She put it down. She didn't look at him, afraid that any movement would shatter this fragile moment. "I had a presentation, a big one, for the Bankside development." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "As if any of that mattered. She called me. Her voice was so small. She said, 'Daddy, my head hurts.' And I told her to be brave, to tell Mummy that I'd be home soon." The words hung in the air, a confession he had carried for over a year. "I've gone over that phone call 1,000 times, he whispered. "If I had just come home, if I had just known, maybe they would have caught it sooner. Maybe." "It was a headache, David," Imogen said, her own voice soft. "It was just a headache. I gave her Calpol and put her to bed. I didn't know either. You can't do that to yourself." "But you do, don't you?" he said, finally turning to look at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "You blame yourself for not seeing it, for not knowing it was meningitis and not a virus." A fresh tear traced a path through the grime on Imogen's cheek. She nodded, unable to speak. "I don't blame you," David said, the words simple and absolute. "I have never for 1 second blamed you." The statement was so profound, so freeing, it stole her breath. They had been drowning in separate oceans of guilt, each thinking they were alone in their self-recrimination. "I found her project book because I was looking for her scent," Imogen admitted, the shame of it finally loosening its grip. "I was on my knees, holding her jumper, and I found it. It felt like a sign, a message. I was so afraid you would think I was mad." "I did," he admitted quietly. "I thought you were breaking, and I was so angry that you were, because I needed you to be strong so I could fall apart." He paused. "When I saw you on that hill, with that book, you didn't look broken. You looked alive. For the first time since, you looked alive, and I hated you for it." It was the truest thing he had said to her since he had arrived. "I'm not building it for her," Imogen said, the realization dawning on her as she spoke the words. I think I'm building it for me, because if I stop, I don't know what's left." David was silent for a long time, watching the flames consume a piece of peat. "I know," he said finally. "I know." He didn't move to hold her. She didn't reach for him. The chasm was still too wide, the wounds too fresh. But for the first time, they were no longer standing on opposite sides, shouting across the void. They were sitting together in the darkness, acknowledging the depth of the ravine and the long, difficult climb that lay ahead. Outside, the rain softened to a steady patter. The storm was passing, and inside the cottage, in the quiet language of a shared, unbearable grief, something had finally begun to heal. Chapter 7. The Shape of a Memory. The morning after the storm dawned clear and washed clean. The world sparkled. Every blade of grass and sprig of heather jeweled with droplets. The air was sharp and new. Up on the hill, their worst fears were confirmed. The tarpaulin was gone, shredded, and wrapped around a gorse bush half a mile away. But the stone wall stood, solid and unmoved, the mortar still dark with rain. It was a small victory, but a profound one. The hill had thrown its worst at them, and their work had endured. The storm, and the confessions it had forced, had shifted something fundamental. The silence between David and Imogen was no longer hostile, but contemplative. They began to discuss the project, not as a point of conflict, but as a series of problems to be solved together. The house was no longer Imogen's folly or David's penance. It was simply the build. It was David who broached the subject of utilities one evening, a week after the storm. He had the project book open on the kitchen table, not with resentment, but with the focus of a senior architect reviewing junior drafts. "Right," he said, tapping a drawing of the interior. "She's got the fireplace for stories and toast. That's heat-covered. We can source a good, efficient wood-burning stove. But we need light. We need power for tools, eventually. And we need water." Imogen looked up from mending in her work gloves. "Hamish mentioned a local man who drills boreholes. He said the water table up there is surprisingly high." "A borehole!" David nodded, making a note on a fresh pad of paper the first real project plan. "That's the answer. Then we can plumb in a simple system, a small hot water tank heated by the stove." He was in his element now, the pragmatist building a framework around the dream. For power. "The grid is miles away. The connection cost would be astronomical." "Solar?" Imogen suggested. "And a wind turbine?" "A small one. Christine wrote that the wind sings. We might as well make it work for us." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched David's lips. A hybrid system. Solar and wind, with a battery bank and a backup generator for the depths of winter. He looked at her, a genuine, professional respect in his eyes. "That's a very good idea." The next few weeks saw a flurry of new activity. The borehole drillers arrived with their massive, noisy rig, the tractor guiding them carefully up the track. The sound of the drill biting deep into the earth was a roar of progress. At 60 meters, they struck a clean, strong aquifer. When the water was tested and declared potable, they celebrated with a cup of tea made from it, tasting of peat and deep stone. David took charge of the power system, researching and ordering solar panels, a small, silent wind turbine, and a stack of heavy batteries. It was a complex puzzle, and he lost himself in the schematics, the calculation of amp hours and peak sun hours a welcome distraction from the calculus of grief. The physical work continued too. The stone walls rose past their shoulders, the curved shape of the house now unmistakable. One afternoon, a woman from the village, Morag's friend, came walking her dog across the lower slopes. She detoured up to the site, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Well, now," she said, her accent melodic. "I'd heard there was some daft southerners building a roundhouse, but it's bonny, so it is. What a wonderful thing to be doing for your family. A proper legacy." The word legacy hung in the air after she had gone. David and Imogen stopped work, looking at the structure they were creating. It wasn't a tombstone. It wasn't a retreat. It was a home. A home Christine had designed for a life that was never lived, but which they were now building in her memory. The woman's innocent comment had reframed everything. They began to refer to the features by the names Christine had given them. It was no longer the south-facing window, it was the sunbeam window. The low section of wall where the wind was fiercest became the grumpy wind's wall. It was a language of kine, love, a secret code that wove their daughter's spirit into every stone. One evening, as they were cleaning their tools, David held up a smooth, flat piece of gray slate. "We need a lintel for the sunbeam window," he said. "This would work, but it needs a signature." He took a metal scribe from his tool belt, and there, in the fading light, with a careful, deliberate hand, he began to etch. He didn't write his name, or Imogen's, or even Christine's. He carved the simple, looping shape of a cartoon owl, its eyes wide and wise, a perfect replica of the one on the mug that was now packed away in a London storage unit. Imogen watched, her throat tight. When he was finished, he held it out to her. She took it, her fingers tracing the grooves he had made. It was an act of remembrance more powerful than any words. "Thank you," she whispered. He simply nodded. The house was no longer just a shape in the landscape. It was becoming a vessel, its walls slowly being filled not just with stone and mortar, but with the silent, shared language of their love for a little girl who had drawn them a map, not just to a hill in Scotland, but back to each other. Chapter 8. The Vessel. Spring bled into a soft, green Highland summer. The heather, which had been a dormant brown, began to blush with a hint of the purple glory to come. The magic house was no longer just walls, it was a structure awaiting its skin. The roof timbers were in place, a beautiful, radiating pattern of Douglas fir beams that formed a conical skeleton against the sky, exactly as Christine had sketched a pointy hat for the house, as her note had said. The rhythm of their days had settled into something that was no longer just about survival or relentless labor. There was a quiet synergy to their work. David, with his innate understanding of structure and physics, handled the complex tasks, fitting the window frames, designing the clever joinery for the stargazing room's skylight, and orchestrating the installation of the solar panels and the small, whirring wind turbine. Imogen's domain was the soul of the place. She mixed the earthy lime plaster for the interior walls, her hands smoothing the walls until they were soft and rounded. She built the deep windowsills, perfect for a child to sit on and read, and she began planting the meadow roof, carefully tucking plugs of sedum and wildflower turf into the substrate. One afternoon, a delivery truck arrived at the end of the track, its contents long and carefully wrapped. David and Imogen used the tractor to haul it up, a silent, shared anticipation hanging between them. Inside the packaging was the front door. It was not the red Christine had drawn. David had quietly suggested a more muted forest green that would age with the landscape, and Imogen had agreed. But set into its center, at a child's eye level, was a circular window of stained glass. It was David's secret project, commissioned from an artist in Inverness. As they maneuvered the door into place, the summer sun caught the glass. It burst into life, casting a kaleidoscope of color onto the new flagstone floor. The design was not a religious symbol, but a representation of the hill itself: purple heather, green bracken, a yellow sun, and a single cartoon owl hidden amongst the patterns. Imogen stood in the splash of colored light, her hand over her mouth. She looked from the door to David, her eyes brimming. "So she can always find it," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "No matter what." It was the most tender thing he had done since Christine's death. The house was no longer just a vessel for their grief. It was becoming a vessel for their love for her, and in a fragile, nascent way for each other. That night, they didn't go back to the cottage. They built their first fire in the new hearth, the fireplace for stories and toast. The smoke curled up, finding its way out of the chimney for the very first time, a signal to the glen that the heart of the house was now beating. They sat on upturned crates, wrapped in blankets, and ate soup from a thermos, watching the flames dance. The shell was complete. They were inside the drawing. The wind still sang, but it was outside now. Inside, there was only the crackle of the fire and a peace so profound it felt like a form of grace. Chapter 9. Where the Heather Grows. Autumn arrived, painting the cairngorms in a blaze of gold and rust. The heather was in full, magnificent bloom, a royal purple carpet that stretched to the horizon. The house was finished. The last shelf was fixed to the wall for treasures, rocks, feathers, lost buttons. The red Rayburn was installed in the kitchen nook, heating the water and radiating a steady, comforting warmth. The house smelled of fresh wood, lime plaster, and peat smoke. It was the eve of the first anniversary of their arrival on the hill, a year since Imogen had stood there alone, buffeted by the wind and her own despair. They had decided to stay the night in the finished house. The crates were replaced with 2 simple armchairs David had made, positioned before the fire and under the stargazing room's skylight. The night was crystal clear, the Milky Way a brilliant, dusty river across the black velvet of the sky. Imogen reached into her bag and brought out the blue project book. She didn't open it. She simply held it on her lap, her hand resting on its cover. "It's done," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet awe. David looked around the room. The firelight played on the curves of the walls, the stained glass owl gleamed in the dark, and the vastness of the universe was visible through the roof. "It is." "It doesn't bring her back," Imogen whispered, the old, familiar ache rising. But it was a cleaner pain now, acknowledged and shared. "No," David agreed, his gaze fixed on the stars. "But it holds the space for her. It makes the absence feel less like an empty void and more like a presence." He finally looked at her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "We built her a home, Imogen, and in doing so, I think we built one for ourselves, too." He stood up and went to a small wooden box on one of the deep shelves. He brought it back and placed it in her hands. It was simple, made from a piece of scrap oak left over from the roof beams. "I thought we should," he began, then cleared his throat. "I thought we should leave a part of her here." Imogen opened the box. Inside, on a bed of velvet, was a small sealed porcelain vial. She knew what it was without asking. A tiny portion of the ashes they had been unable to part with a year ago, when the grief was too raw, the future too dark. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not the desperate, suffocating tears of before. They were tears of release, of love, of a journey completed. Together, they went to the sunbeam window. On the deep sill, David had carved a small, hidden compartment. He opened it, and Imogen placed the little vial inside. "She's home," she said. David put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. It was the first real, sustained embrace they had shared in over a year. It was awkward at first, the geography of their bodies unfamiliar, but then it settled into a perfect fit. They stood there, wrapped in each other and the silence of the house, watching the constellations wheel slowly overhead. The next morning, the sun rose, just as Christine had planned, and poured a shaft of brilliant gold directly through the sunbeam window. It traveled across the flagstones, illuminating the spot where they stood, and finally came to rest, warm and alive, on the sill where their daughter now lived in the light. The house on the hill was quiet, but it was no longer silent. It was filled with the memory of a child's laughter, the scent of wood smoke, and the quiet, resilient love of her parents. It was not an end to the grief, but a transformation of it. The heather bloomed purple outside, the wind sang its ancient song, and inside, where the heather grew in their hearts, there was finally, at long last, peace. Thank you for listening to Where the Heather Grows by Beryl Coops. If this story found a quiet place in you, I'd love to hear which moment stayed behind the image, the line, or the feeling you carried away. Drop a comment below. I read everyone. If you enjoyed it, please tap the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next story when it lands. Sharing the video with a friend who loves reflective, atmospheric tales really helps the channel grow. You can add this to your favorite playlist for easy re-listening, and if you'd like more, explore the other stories waiting on the channel. Until next time, take care. Keep a little wild country in your heart, and let the quiet places speak.